A gavel comes down in a cold county hall, and 40 people laugh at an old man holding his last $900. Wide, a Midwestern field gone brown with late winter flat to every horizon. Tighten in, a rusted half-barrel of corrugated steel squats in the weeds. 3 acres nobody wanted sold for the price of a used truck. Closer now. Through the gap in a sliding door, something waits in the dark. Tarps, shapes, a stenciled name no one has spoken in 40 years. And the dog will not stop circling it. He was 81. His children had taken everything that had a price. The town had already decided how his story ended, except his father left something buried out here. And a black sedan is already turning onto the gravel road, headlights off the night before everything breaks open. The auctioneer's gavel came down like a gunshot. Lot 47, 3 acres on Stillwater Lane, 1 structure, listed condition, salvage. Somebody laughed. It was a soft laugh, the kind people give when they've already decided how a thing is going to end, the kind that doesn't even bother to be cruel because it's so sure of itself. Harold Ashcombe did not laugh. He sat very still in a metal folding chair that was too cold for an 81-year-old man, and he pressed his hand flat against the inside of his coat pocket. $900 in there, folded tight, folded so many times, the creases had gone soft as cloth, as if folding the money smaller could somehow make it last longer, as if a man could squeeze a future out of paper by sheer will. Beside him sat Eleanor, 79 years old, her breathing thin and careful, each one measured out like she was rationing it, one hand resting in her lap, the other resting on the broad, warm head of the dog at her feet. Ranger. The dog wasn't sleeping. Ranger never really slept in rooms full of strangers. His eyes moved. Door, window, the man at the podium, the men in seed caps lined along the back wall with their arms crossed and their judgments already made. The dog tracked all of them, ears swiveling, the posture of an animal who still believed his job mattered. He was 11 years old, gray coming in around the muzzle like frost, and he still believed his job mattered. Opening bid, the auctioneer said. 500. Do I hear 500? Nothing. A cough, a chair creaking, somebody's phone buzzing in a pocket and getting silence. 400 then. 3 acres, folks. There's a structure on it. Nothing. 300. Come on. Somebody wants a project. And Harold raised his hand. Heads turned. They turned slow the way heads do when people want to see something and pretend they don't. He felt the weight of it. 40, 50 faces. People he'd known his whole life. People he'd loaned equipment to. People whose cattle he'd helped pull out of spring mud at 2 a.m. without being asked twice. He heard the whisper start somewhere behind him. That's Harold Ashcombe. Lost the farm. Lost his mind too, looks like. 300 to the gentleman, the auctioneer said. Do I hear 350 at 350? Harold knew that voice. Didn't have to turn. Jed Coker, who ran the salvage yard out on the county road and had the soul of a man who priced everything by the scrap. Jed would strip the place down to the rivets and call it a Tuesday. 400, Harold said. His voice didn't shake. He was almost proud of that. 450. Eleanor's hand found his arm. Light. Just 2 fingers. But he knew what it meant. They'd agreed. 800 was the ceiling. Every dollar past that was a dollar they might need for something that couldn't wait. Medicine, gas, food that wasn't from a can. 500, Harold said. The whispers got louder. Somebody near the front muttered something about throwing good money after bad. Carl Henley, probably. Dairyman, property bordered Stillwater on the north. The kind of neighbor who waves at you from his truck for 40 years and lets you sleep in a church parking lot when the world falls in. Jed Coker took a long moment. Harold could feel him doing the arithmetic. Scrap value minus the hassle of hauling. Too rich for me, Jed said finally. You want that rust pile old-timer? It's yours. 500. Going once. A breath. Going twice. The gavel. Sold. to Harold Ashcombe, and the room let out a little sound, not quite a laugh, something softer and worse, pity, the collective exhale of 40 people who have just watched a man buy his own foolishness and pay cash for it. Harold stood. His knees told him about it. He helped Eleanor up with one hand under her elbow, and Ranger rose between them, pressing close, herding them toward the door, the way he'd herd a stubborn ewe. The paperwork took 20 minutes. He signed his name in the places the man pointed. He counted out $500 from the folded brick in his pocket, and his hands didn't shake, doing that either, which surprised him. The man gave him a key, an old key, brass gone dark, a key that hadn't turned a lock in longer than some of these people had been alive, and then they walked out into the thin gray light of a March afternoon. Behind him he heard Carl Henley's voice, not even lowered. "Harold, what in God's name are you going to do with 3 acres of weeds and a tin can?" Harold did not turn around. "Live on it," he said. The laughter followed them all the way to the borrowed van. Here is a thing nobody tells you about getting old. You become invisible by degrees. It doesn't happen all at once. First, the young clerks start talking a little louder, a little slower, like your ears went before your mind did. Then people stop asking your opinion. Then they stop asking how you are. And then one morning you wake up and you're furniture, you're weather, you're a thing that's simply there taking up space until somebody decides you shouldn't. Harold had felt that long, slow fading for years, but it was not the same as what his son had done, because what Garrett had done was not neglect. It was theft. It had a shape and a date and a signature. The van smelled like old hymnals and somebody else's coffee. Pastor Reyes had loaned it to them. He was the one man in Hartwell who'd actually shown up, who'd actually said the words, "What do you need?" and then stayed long enough to hear the answer. The church lot was where they'd been sleeping 3 months. An 81-year-old man and his 79-year-old wife and a dog sleeping in a van in a church parking lot in the dead cold middle of a Midwestern winter. And not one of his 3 children had come. Eleanor was quiet on the drive out. She watched Hartwell slide past the window, the hardware store where Harold had bought seed and bolts and work gloves for 60 years, the diner where they'd taken the same booth every Saturday morning since Eisenhower was president, the bank. He looked at the bank a beat too long. "You're chewing on something," Eleanor said. She always knew. 62 years of marriage, and the woman could read the back of his neck. Just thinking about what they said back there. She reached over, took his hand. Her fingers were thinner than they used to be, the skin papery. But the grip was the same grip that had pulled him up off the floor the night the foreclosure papers came, and he'd just sat down, right there in the kitchen, sat down on the linoleum like his strings got cut. "It doesn't matter what they say," he told her. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." A pause. "But it still stings." "Yeah," he said. "It still stings." He turned the van onto the county road, out past the edge of town where the houses thinned and the fields opened up brown and dead and waiting. "I'm going to build us something, he said. "I don't know what yet, but I'm going to build us a place that's ours, with whatever we've got left." "And what have we got left, Harold?" He almost laughed. $400, a tin can held together by rust and stubbornness. A beat. "And you." Ranger lifted his head from the seat. "And Ranger." The dog's tail thumped once against the upholstery. "That's not nothing," Harold said. "That's not nothing at all." The property came up on the right just as the light started going gold. He'd been out here once before. 2 weeks ago alone, when he'd seen the listing in the paper and driven out with Ranger riding shotgun while Eleanor rested. He'd looked at it then with the eyes of a man trying not to hope, and he'd seen exactly what the listing promised. 3 acres of overgrown nothing and a Quonset hut squatting in the middle of it like something the war had forgotten to clean up. But it looked different now. He couldn't have said why. Same rust, same weeds, same curved roof of corrugated steel gone the brown-red color of dried blood. But this time, when he pulled the van up the rutted track and killed the engine, the place didn't look like a joke. It looked like it was waiting. Ranger was out the door before Harold got it half open. The dog hit the ground and immediately started a wide, slow circle of the structure, nose down, tail level, with his spine. Not playing, not wandering, the serious, focused gait of a working dog doing a working dog's job. Harold knew that walk. He'd seen it the day Ranger found the break in the north fence before any human did. He'd seen it the spring a newborn calf wandered off in a storm, and Ranger led him straight to it through driving rain. That walk meant, I have found something and you should come look. It's bigger than I remembered, Eleanor said. She was picking her way through the dead grass, one hand trailing along Ranger's back when he circled close enough, using the dog like a banister. She was right. He'd guessed 40 feet long from the listing. Standing in front of it now, he revised. 50 easy, maybe more. The thing was enormous, a relic from the years after the war, when farmers used these steel half-barrels for everything grain equipment, the overflow of a country that had suddenly figured out how to make too much of everything. He put his palm flat against the door, cold, even in the late sun, rough with corrosion under his hand. The main door was a huge sliding panel on a rusted track, and it stood a few inches open, and through the gap there was nothing but dark. He pushed. It groaned, but it moved, easier than it had any right to, sliding back along the track with a long metal complaint that echoed out across the empty acres, and the light fell in, a golden shaft of it slicing through the dust, lighting up what had been sitting in that dark for longer than Harold had been a grown man. The Quonset was not empty. Against the far wall, under canvas tarps, gone gray and stiff with decades of dust, were shapes, and Harold's 60 years of farming knew those shapes the way you know a face. Machinery, equipment, the unmistakable hump of something that was either a tractor or a baler, and around it, stacked and shelved and ordered, the silhouettes of tools and crates and the careful hoarding of a man who understood exactly what every single thing was worth. Harold, Eleanor whispered, is that equipment? Yeah, he said. His voice came out strange. It is. Ranger had already gone in. His nails clicked on the concrete floor, the sound bouncing around the curved steel, and he wasn't sniffing at the tarps or the machinery. He went straight back, straight to a corner where steel shelving stood deep in shadow, and he sat down and he looked back at Harold. That look, ears up, body still, the whole animal pointed like a compass needle. Here, it's here, come. He's found something, Eleanor said. He always does. Harold crossed the floor, careful, picking his way around the shrouded shapes, his boots loud in the silence. The shelving was industrial, heavy steel bolted right into the wall of the hut, stacked with boxes and cans and containers he couldn't name in the dim. But it was the bottom shelf that stopped him. A metal box, about the size of a small suitcase, army green, the kind of surplus container you saw everywhere in the years after the war, when half the country was furnished out of government overstock. A padlock hung on it, but the lock had rusted clean through. It fell open at his touch, and stenciled on the side, just barely there under the dust of decades, were 3 letters. WJA. Harold stopped breathing. He knew those letters. He'd seen them on a footlocker as a boy, on a toolbox, on the brass nameplate of a man who almost never raised his voice, and almost never said, I love you, and almost never explained himself to anyone about anything. Walter James Ashcombe, his father, dead since 1985. L, Harold said, and his voice did not sound like his own. L, come look at this. He carried the box outside, into the dying light, set it on the tailgate of the van with a care he usually reserved for newborn animals, and he lifted the lid. Ranger sat at his feet and watched, intent, the way the dog always watched the things he found, like he was waiting to see if the humans would finally understand what he'd understood all along. Inside the box was a life, or a piece of one. On top, a leather journal, cover cracked but whole. Under that, a stack of photographs bound with a rubber band that crumbled to dust the instant Harold touched it. Documents in manila folders gone soft as felt. A pocket watch, the hand stopped at some hour that hadn't mattered for 40 years. And at the very bottom, folded careful, a hand-drawn map, the annotations on it in a tight slanted hand that Harold would have known anywhere. "Your father never told you about any of this?" Eleanor asked. "My father never told me anything. He said it without bitterness, just fact. The man came back from the war, and he never talked about before, said the past was past, bought the farm, worked it till his heart quit. I was 41 when I buried him, and I thought," he stopped. "I thought I knew him." He opened the journal. The first page was dated in that same tight hand, August 1946. He read it out loud slow, because his eyes weren't what they were. "Found a place to start over. 3 acres on Stillwater Lane with a Quonset I can fit out for storage. Nobody knows about the money yet, and I intend to keep it that way until I know who I can trust. The farm comes first. Everything else can wait." Harold looked up. "Money," he said. "He's talking about money. He was hiding something." "Keep reading." He turned the pages with the tips of his fingers, afraid they'd come apart. The entries ran for almost 2 years. The purchase of this property, which his father had owned secretly the whole time, the entire time Harold was growing up, not 3 miles away. The slow, careful stockpiling of equipment, and then cryptic again and again references to the account, to the arrangement, to Des Moines, and then one entry, March 1948. "The banker in Des Moines says the certificates have matured well. I've put the Stillwater deed in the deposit box with the rest. Someday when the time is right, this all goes to whoever needs it most. I've seen what happens when families fight over money. Better to let it wait. Better to let it find the right hands." Harold's hands had started to shake. He looked at Ranger. The dog looked back with those steady amber eyes, and Harold had the unsettling feeling, not for the first time in 11 years, that the animal understood more than he was letting on. "He left something behind," Harold said slowly. "He bought this place separate from the farm, hid it, stored all this, and something in Des Moines. Certificates, some kind of," he shook his head, "investments maybe. And nobody knew. Nobody. Not my mother. Not me." His throat worked. Not Garrett. The name dropped between them like a stone down a well. And Eleanor understood before he finished, because she always understood first. "When Garrett did all his maneuvering," she said, "when he moved everything around, the farm was all anyone knew about. The farm was all there was to know about." Harold's voice came out hard and quiet. "This place, whatever's in Des Moines, he couldn't touch it. He couldn't touch it because he didn't know it was there." And then it hit him, the whole weight of it, what it meant, what it might mean. His father, that silent, frowning, undemonstrative man who died believing, as far as Harold knew, that he and his son had nothing much to say to each other. His father had reached 40 years past the grave and laid a hand on his shoulder. Hope. It was a terrible, fragile, dangerous thing, because the certificates might be worthless. The bank might be gone. 40 years, wars and crashes, and a dozen recessions. The journal was older than most of the people who'd laughed at him today. But Harold stood a little straighter in the dying light. He looked at the Quonset, really looked at it, and for the first time he didn't see what it was. He saw what it could become. Now, about Garrett, because you have to understand how it happened, or none of the rest of it makes any sense. It did not happen the way you'd think. There was no shouting, no villain twirling a mustache. That's the thing nobody tells you about how families come apart. It happens politely. It happens over coffee. It happens with paperwork and reassuring smiles and a son who went to the right schools and wears the right watch and uses words like diversification and tax advantage and "Dad, just trust me, this is what I do." Garrett ran money for a living, other people's money. He was good at sounding good at it. 3 years ago, he'd come to the farm, the real farm, the 100-year Ashcombe farm, and he'd sat at Eleanor's kitchen table and laid out folders and spoken gently to two people in their late 70s about how their land was a frozen asset, how they were cash poor, how at their age it was simply responsible to unlock the equity and let him manage it properly so they'd be comfortable. He used the word comfortable a great deal, and Harold, God help him, had signed, because the man was his son, because you raise a child and you spend 2 decades teaching him to tie his shoes and ride a bike, and you stand in the rain at his graduation, and somewhere in all of that, you build a faith in him that does not bend to evidence that does not break, that survives long past the point where any reasonable man would have started asking harder questions. He signed, and 18 months later, the investments had unfortunately not performed, and the farm the deed had moved, the structure was complicated. Harold never did fully understand the structure, which he supposed was the entire point. The farm was gone, and the money was gone, and Garrett was very sorry, and there were risks disclosed, and these things happen in markets, and then he had brought the pamphlet, a nursing home, glossy, smiling silver-haired models on the cover who were paid to look content. Garrett had set it on the table, the same table, the kitchen table, except now it was in a storage unit because the kitchen wasn't theirs anymore, and he'd slid it across with 2 fingers. "It's a good facility, Dad. You'd be comfortable." That word again. And then Garrett had looked at Ranger lying in the corner, and he'd said the thing. He'd said, "They don't allow animals, but don't worry about it. I'll take care of the dog. I'll take care of the dog." Like Ranger was a problem. Like 11 years of loyalty was a logistics issue to be handled on the way out the door. That was the moment. Not the farm, not the money. Harold could almost have forgiven the money, told himself it was incompetence and not malice. But the dog, the casual disposal of the dog, that was the moment Harold looked at his firstborn son and saw clear as cold water a stranger wearing a familiar face. He had said no. It was the only word he'd had left. No. And then he and Eleanor and the dog had gone to live in a church parking lot because his son had words like diversification, and his father, it turned out, had had a Quonset hut on Stillwater Lane. Caroline was the second one. His daughter. She lived 2 states over, had a life, a husband, a calendar she guarded like a border. When the farm went, Caroline had called. Once. She'd been so sorry to hear it. She'd said it was a shame. She'd said she wished there was something she could do in the specific tone people use when they are making certain you understand there is nothing they will do. She had signed something for Garrett. Harold didn't know exactly what yet, but he knew she'd signed because Garrett never moved on anything that big without his sister's name beside his. They were a match set, those two. Had been since they were small, cold the same way, practical the same way. They'd looked at their parents and seen somewhere along the line, not people, but a resource, an estate with a pulse. And the third one, Everett, the youngest, the soft one, the one who'd cried at sad movies and worried about everything, and never in his life won an argument with his older brother. Everett hadn't called at all, not once, and Harold didn't know which was worse, Garrett's theft, Caroline's chilly nothing, or Everett's silence. The silence had a quality to it, like a held breath, like a man standing at the back of a room watching something terrible happen and choosing again and again to say not one word. Harold had loved all 3 of them more than his own life. That was the part that didn't fit anywhere. That was the part he carried around like a stone in his boot. You could survive being robbed. People survive being robbed all the time. What you weren't built to survive was loving someone with your whole chest and finding out they'd been counting you up the whole time, tallying you like livestock, deciding what you were worth and what you cost. They slept in the van that first night. The Quonset was too cold, too open, too full of 40 years of dark. So they slept in the van one more night with the dog wedged between them like a furnace, and Harold lay awake and listened to Eleanor's careful breathing and watched the dark bulk of the hut through the windshield. What kind of man, he thought, hides an entire second life from his own family and then slower? What kind of man teaches his son, without ever meaning to, that love is a thing you can put a price on? He didn't sleep much. At first light, he eased out of the van without waking her. Ranger lifted his head, but Harold made the small, flat gesture that meant stay, and the dog settled, though his eyes followed Harold out into the gray. The morning air had a bite to it, late winter still holding on with both hands, but underneath the cold there was something else, a green smell, faint, the smell of things getting ready, down in the dirt where you couldn't see them yet. Harold walked the boundary of his 3 acres. 3 acres. It wasn't much. Set against the 200 he'd lost. It was a joke, a thing to laugh at, and the town had laughed. But as he walked the line, he started to understand why his father had chosen this particular piece of ground out of all the ground in the county. It sloped gentle toward a creek along the east edge. The soil where winter had killed back the weeds showed dark and rich bottomland, the kind that would grow anything you had the nerve to plant. A stand of old oaks bunched up in the northwest corner, windbreak, firewood for whoever lived long enough to need it, and the Quonset sat on the highest ground safe from any flood the creek might ever throw. Walter Ashcombe had not bought junk. He'd bought potential, and then he'd buried it in plain sight 3 miles from his own front door, and he'd carried the secret of it all the way into the ground. When Harold got back, Eleanor was up. She'd coaxed their little camp stove to life, and the smell of coffee weak, made from grounds they'd already used, twice cut through the morning chill like a promise. "You walked it," she said. It wasn't a question. "It's good land, El. It's real good land." She handed him a tin cup. "So what's the plan?" He'd thought about it all night. "First, we make the hut livable, somewhere to sleep that isn't this van." He wrapped his hands around the warm cup. "Second, we get to Des Moines. We find out what he left in that box." "Des Moines is 150 miles. "I know. That's gas we don't have, Harold." "I know that too." He looked at the Quonset, at all that shrouded equipment waiting in the dark. "Which is why we start here. Some of what he stored might be worth something, maybe enough to get us there and back." Ranger came out of the van, then stretched long and luxurious and padded over to lean his whole weight against Harold's leg. Then he turned and looked at the Quonset, and then back at Harold. "He wants to show us something else," Eleanor said. "He always does." The morning sun did something to the inside of the hut that the day before's dying light hadn't. It made it beautiful. Light came through the gaps in the corrugated panels in long gold bars full of slow-turning dust, and it lit up 40 years of one careful man's preparation. Harold had only scratched the surface yesterday. Now, with Eleanor beside him and Ranger ranging through the space like a general inspecting troops, the whole scope of it came clear. The tractor, a 1947 Farmall red paint, faded but the bones of it sound. A baler, a disc harrow blades dull but whole. Hand tools hung on a pegboard along the wall, every single one outlined in white paint so you'd know in a glance if anything had gone missing. Cans of food labels, faded seals tight, rolls of copper wire, nails sorted by size into labeled jars, kerosene lanterns with the reservoirs still full, wool blankets wrapped in paper that crackled when Harold touched it. He was getting ready for something, Eleanor said, softly, like he thought the whole world might come apart. He came back from the war a different man. Everybody said so. Harold ran a thumb over a wrench worn smooth by a dead man's hand. "I think he just wanted to make sure that no matter what happened, no matter how bad it got, somebody in this family could survive it." That was when Ranger barked. Once, sharp, from the far end of the hut. He stood near a section of wall, half hidden behind a stack of heavy wooden crates, and he had the look again. That pointed, certain come-here look. Harold went. Eleanor followed slower, her breath catching on the dust, and Harold shifted the crates. They were heavy full of God knew what, and his back let him know about every one of them until he'd cleared enough to see what the dog was scratching at. A door, not the big sliding panel at the front, a smaller one, man-sized, set into a steel frame welded right into the curved wall. Padlocked, same brand of lock as the box, same rust, same surrender the second Harold put the bolt cutters from the tool wall to it. The door swung in, and out of the dark behind it came a smell that reached straight back into Harold's childhood and squeezed earth, concrete, motor oil, and old paper, the specific perfume of a root cellar, of an underground place where time runs slower than it does up in the light. "There's a cellar," Harold said. He could hardly believe his own voice. He built a cellar under the hut. Ranger went down the concrete steps into the black without a moment's hesitation, his nails clicking away into the dark, and Harold lit one of the old kerosene lanterns with a match that had no business still working after 40 years, and he followed his dog down into his father's last secret. The lantern light swung through shadows that climbed the poured concrete walls. The cellar was maybe 30 feet square, cold straight up through the soles of his boots, and the walls were lined floor to ceiling with shelving. But this was different from the hut above. This was personal. Boxes marked photos, letters, army, a footlocker with his father's name stenciled on the lid, the same footlocker that had crossed an ocean and come home again. And in the center of the room, on a small wooden table, sat another metal box, newer than the one above, much newer. The lock on it still shone, still bright, despite all the years of underground damp. Harold's hands shook as he opened it. Inside was a single envelope, and on the front, in a hand grown shakier than the journal, a hand from much later. From near the end, one word, his name, Harold. He sank down onto the bottom step, set the lantern beside him. Ranger came and pressed against his leg, warm and solid and real in the cold dark, and Eleanor's hand found his shoulder from above, and Harold opened the letter his father had written him from the other side of 40 years of silence. "Harold, if you're reading this, then it went bad enough that you had to find your way here. I'm sorry for that. I always hoped the farm would be enough, that you'd never need what I put away. The certificates I wrote about are in a safe deposit box. First Federal of Des Moines, Box 443. The key is taped under this one. The bank may have changed hands by now. I paid the box up through 2020, and after that, son, I don't rightly know what happens. There's a letter in there for whoever runs the bank. It explains everything and gives you the right to claim what's inside. I should have told you all this while I was alive. I should have trusted you, but I saw too many families torn to pieces by money, by inheritance, by the poison of expecting a thing you never earned. I wanted you to build your own life with your own hands and know that everything you had you'd made. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I should have prepared you better than this. All I can do now is leave you what I can and hope it's enough. The land provides for the ones who don't give up on it. I meant that when I wrote it, and I mean it now. Whatever it was that brought you here, don't let it break you. You come from people who lived through worse. I love you, son. I should have said it more when I had the breath to." Dad Harold read it 3 times before he trusted himself to make a sound. When he finally looked up, the tears were running down into the lines of his face, and he didn't bother to stop them. He knew, he said. Somehow, he knew this would happen. No, Eleanor's voice was gentle, but sure, he didn't know it would. He just understood that life can take everything from a person without any warning at all. So he got ready. He built you a net you never knew was under you. Down in the dark, the key was right where his father said, taped to the bottom of the box. Small, brass, still bright after all those buried years. Harold held it up to the lantern light. 150 miles away, in a city he'd been to maybe 4 times in his whole life, there was a box with his father's name on a 40-year-old grudge against the way families ruin each other, and $400 between him and it. Okay, Harold said. His voice steadied as he said it, the way a man's voice steadies when he finally has a direction to point himself in. He scratched Ranger behind the ears, and the dog leaned into it, and up above them, the morning sun came down through the gaps in the steel and lit the dust like something holy. Okay, Des Moines, Eleanor agreed. What neither of them knew yet, what they couldn't have known, standing there in the cold gold light of that first real morning, was that they weren't the only ones who'd heard about the Ashcombe family's bad luck, and they weren't the only ones now beginning to wonder exactly what Walter Ashcombe had left behind. To get to Des Moines, they needed gas. To get gas, they needed money. And to get money, Harold needed to sell something. He found it on the third day, buried in a corner of the hut. He hadn't fully cleared under a tarp behind the Harrow 3 50-gallon drums of diesel, sealed, stabilized. The fuel inside still amber and clean when he cracked a seal and looked. His father had even thought of that. Of course he had. The man had thought of everything except how to say 4 simple words to his own son while he was still breathing. Harold tested a sample in the van. The engine ran clean. That's 3 drums, he told Eleanor that night, doing the arithmetic on the back of an envelope by lantern light. Diesel's going for around 4 a gallon in town. That's $600, Eleanor said. If somebody will buy it, somebody will buy it. A pause. Frank Whitley will buy it. The name sat there between them, because Frank Whitley had been a friend, once, back when the Ashcombe name still meant something in Hartwell, back before the auction, before the church lot. Frank ran the feed store on Main, had run it 40 years, and somewhere in the last bad season, he joined the long, quiet line of people who'd suddenly gotten too busy to look Harold in the eye. You think he'll deal with you? Eleanor asked. Frank's a businessman. Harold folded the envelope. He'll deal with anybody if the price is right. He drove into Hartwell alone the next morning, and the conversation by the register died the second he walked through the door, just stopped, like a needle lifted off a record. 2 farmers near the seed display found very interesting things to look at on distant shelves, and Frank Whitley looked up from his paperwork, and his face did a whole little play in 3 seconds, surprise, then something that looked a lot like shame, then a careful, flat businessman's nothing. Harold. Frank. The silence stretched. I've got diesel to sell, Harold said, because there was no point dancing. 3 drums, stabilize, test clean, I'll let it go at $3.50 a gallon. Frank's eyes narrowed. The look of a man who'd been making deals since before either of them went gray. That's under market. I know what it is. I need the money quick and I don't have time to find retail. Where's a man get 3 drums of diesel? My property. Frank stopped himself. I heard about the auction, the Quonset out on Stillwater. That's right. Something moved behind Frank's face. Not pity quite, something next door to it. People are talking, Harold, saying you lost your senses, buying that rust heap. People have been wrong about me before. Frank looked at him a long time, and then he did the thing Harold did not expect. He came around the counter, and he stuck out his hand. I'm sorry, Frank said, quiet, so the farmers couldn't hear. About all of it, what your boy did, how this town treated you and Eleanor. It wasn't right. Harold shook the hand, and something tightened in his throat that he had to swallow down hard. I'll take the diesel, Frank said. $3.50 cash. I'll pick it up tomorrow if you'll draw me a map. The whole thing took 4 minutes. A handshake, directions scrawled on the back of a receipt, and as Harold turned to go, Frank's voice caught him at the door. Whatever it is you're building out there, Frank said, I hope it works. Some of us remember what your family used to mean to this town. A beat. Some of us are rooting for you, even the ones too dumb to say so out loud. Harold nodded. He didn't trust his voice. He walked out into the thin March sun with $525 coming and the strangest feeling in his chest, because for 3 months he'd been invisible, and a man had just looked right at him. Frank came the next morning for the drums, and he brought something else, a propane space heater, 2 full tanks. He hauled it down off the truck bed before Harold could say a word. "What's this?" "Loan that doesn't need paying back." Frank wouldn't meet his eye, suddenly very busy with a strap. "Wife cleaned out the garage, was gonna donate it anyhow, might as well do some good." That night, for the first time, Harold and Eleanor slept inside the Quonset itself, on camp beds made of his father's wool blankets, laid over wooden pallets, the space heater pushing back the cold in a warm orange circle. Ranger curled at the foot of it, all his presence worth more than any locked door ever was. "Tomorrow," Eleanor said into the dark. "Des Moines, are you up for the drive?" "I'm fine. I wasn't asking about you." A pause. "I've been feeling stronger," she said. "Out here, less to carry maybe. My chest doesn't fight me the way it did in town." He'd noticed. Eleanor's lungs had been bad for years, scarring from the work she'd done young, 3 years in a textile mill in the 70s, breathing in things nobody thought twice about back then before anybody knew better. For a long time, she'd measured her breath like coins, but since they'd come out here, away from the noise, away from the dread, away from the slow grinding stress of being unwanted in a town that used to be theirs, she breathed easier. Harold figured it was the calm, the quiet, the simple animal relief of having somewhere to be. The doctors had never given them much hope of it improving, and he wasn't fool enough to think a Quonset hut could mend a thing that medicine couldn't. But stress is its own poison, and out here, for the first time in years, his wife wasn't afraid all the time. Whatever it was, he was grateful for it. He lay in the dark and listened to his wife breathe deep, and even, for the first time in a long while, and he thought, maybe there's something to this place after all. They left at dawn, Ranger in the back seat, head on the center console, positioned so he could watch both of them at once. The highway ran west through farmland, just beginning to shrug off winter. Brown fields, green pushing up at the edges. Harold had called ahead to First Federal, or to what First Federal had become, after 3 mergers and 2 name changes, a thing now called Prairie Trust Financial, that occupied the ground floor of a building that had been impressive once and now wore its age like a tired suit. A manager named Marguerite Vandersloot had taken his call. Long hold times, transfers between departments. But yes, eventually, yes, Box 443 was still active, and yes, the original rental looked to be paid through 2020 with automatic renewals tied to an account that had since gone quiet. "The box is technically in arrears," she'd explained. "We've been trying to reach the account holder for years. If you've got documentation proving you're the rightful heir, we should be able to sort it out." Harold had documentation, his father's letter, the key, his own license proving he was Walter James Ashcombe's only living child. Whether it was enough, that was 150 miles of not knowing. The drive took 3 hours. Des Moines rose up out of the prairie all at once, glass and steel, and traffic that felt like chaos after months of Hartwell's quiet. Harold found parking 2 blocks off, helped Eleanor, outwrapped Ranger's leash twice around his wrist. They might not let him in, Eleanor worried. "Then I'll wait outside with him and you handle the bank." But Marguerite Vandersloot, when she came out of her office to meet them, took one look at the gray-muzzled old dog and smiled. "Is he a service animal?" "He's a farm dog," Harold said. "Best friend I ever had." Her smile widened. "We have a policy about service animals. We don't have one about best friends. Long as he behaves, he's welcome." And Ranger, as if he'd understood every word, as if he knew exactly what was riding on the next 10 minutes, drew himself up and walked beside Harold with the dignity of a dog who had been attending board meetings his entire life. The vault was in the basement, behind a door that took her keycard and a 6-digit code. The room beyond was lined with metal boxes, numbered, labeled cold, with the impersonal patience of a place built to hold other people's secrets. Box 443 was in the bottom row, bigger than Harold expected, 18 inches long, a foot deep. "I'll need your documentation," Marguerite said. Then I'll give you privacy with the contents." Harold handed over everything. She examined each piece, made notes on a tablet, and when she got to the matter of the back rent accrued since 2020, roughly $240, Harold's stomach dropped because they had it, but barely, and barely was a thin place to stand. "However," Marguerite said, and she looked up, "given the circumstances, and given how long this box has been with us, and the institutions before us, I'm authorized to waive the fee." A small smile. "Consider it a courtesy to a very long-standing customer." "Thank you," Harold managed. "You don't know what that means." She turned her key alongside his. The box slid free. She set it on the viewing table, nodded to them both, and left them alone. Ranger sat at Harold's feet, ears forward, watching. Harold lifted the lid. Inside was exactly what his father's letter had promised, and more. Stock certificates bundled in rubber bands, long since rotted to dust, but held tight by the pressure of the box itself. Bearer bonds in denominations that made Harold's vision swim. A savings passbook from First Federal of Des Moines showing a balance from 1985, the year his father died, of $47,000, with a note that it had been converted to a certificate and rolled over year after year, faithful as a heartbeat, and underneath all the cold paper of it, one more envelope, this one in a different hand, feminine, elegant, written on paper that even after decades sealed in the dark smelled faintly of flowers. Harold's whole body went still. He knew that hand. "My darling Harold, if you're reading this, then your father's plan worked, and you found your way here when you needed it. I want you to know this was the two of us, mine and his. We decided it together. We both knew what money can do to a family, how it can poison even the strongest love. The certificates and the bonds are real, and they're yours. Your father invested careful for 30 years, and it grew better than either of us ever dreamed. Use it to build something good. Use it to help people who need helping. Use it to remember that wealth isn't what you have, it's what you do with it. I loved you from the moment you were born, and I'll love you till the stars go dark." Your father wasn't good at saying such things out loud, but I know he felt every word. "Be happy, my son. That's all we ever wanted. With all my love." Mom Harold sat down heavily in the chair Marguerite had left. His mother, Margaret Ashcombe, dead since 2001, 16 years after his father, and in all those years, 16 years, she'd had with him 16 years of Sunday dinners and phone calls and birthdays. She had never said one word. Not about the property, not about the box, not about any of it. She'd carried it the same way her husband had, quiet, patient, trusting it to time and to providence and to the hope that her son would never need it. But if he did, if everything else came apart, it would be down here in the dark, waiting. His whole life Harold had thought of his mother as kind but distant, practical, a woman who showed love in clean shirts and full plates and not much in the way of words. And here she was, reaching up out of a basement vault, 16 years past her own death, to put her hand against his face. "How much?" Eleanor asked quietly, her hand on his shoulder. Harold looked at the certificates, the bonds, the passbook. "I don't know exactly. Some of these they'd have to be checked, verified." He stopped. He couldn't say it. "Tell me." "Hundreds of thousands, Elle." His voice came out a whisper. "Maybe more." Ranger whined, low. He pressed his big head against Harold's leg, the way he did when the air in a room changed, and he could feel the storm coming even before the humans knew it was there. "We're not broke," Harold said, and he started, God help him, to laugh, a cracked, rusty sound he hadn't made in months. "Elle, we were never broke. We just didn't know it yet." She pulled him into her thin, strong arms. "Your parents loved you," she said into his shoulder. "They loved you enough to prepare for the worst and pray for the best. That's the biggest thing a person can give another person." And down in the cold and the quiet, two old people held each other, surrounded by the evidence of a love that had outlasted death. When they finally came up into the spring light, Harold carried a box full of paper and a heart full of something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Purpose. The lawyer's name was Henry Blackfeather. He had an office on the second floor of a brick building on Main Street, above a bakery, so the whole stairwell smelled like fresh bread. He was a compact man in his 60s, silver, running through black hair with eyes that didn't miss much. He'd handled some business for the farm years back, and after the foreclosure, he'd sent a card, a plain one, just "I'm sorry this happened to you," with no excuses attached. It wasn't much, but it was more than almost anybody else had offered. Harold set the box of paper on his desk. Henry put on his reading glasses, and for nearly an hour he went through it all, the certificates, the bonds, the passbook, the letters, making notes on a legal pad, sometimes holding a certificate up to the light. Ranger watched him with the patient intensity of a dog watching a rabbit hole. Finally, Henry set down the glasses, leaned back. "Harold, I'll need to make some calls to verify all this, but based on what I'm seeing," he chose his words careful, "your father was a very smart man with money." "How much, Henry?" Henry met his eyes. "Conservatively, the stocks alone with the conversions and the splits, over the years, 300,000 to 400,000. The bonds, if they're still good, and I'll check another 50, 75. The savings account, with 40 years of compound interest." He spread his hands. "We could be looking at north of $500,000, Harold, maybe more." Eleanor gripped his arm so hard it hurt. "That can't be right," Harold said. "My father was a farmer. He never had that kind of money." "He had time," Henry said it simple, "and patience. These started in the 50s, 60-some years of compound growth. Time's the most powerful force in money there is. Your father understood that." He paused. "What do you want to do? What can I do? Let me verify everything. Few days, a week maybe." Henry leaned forward. "And in the meantime, keep this quiet, because the second word gets out that you've come into money." He didn't have to finish. They both knew who'd come calling. The week that followed was the strangest of Harold's long life. On the surface, nothing changed. He and Eleanor still slept in the hut, still heated wash water on the camp stove, still ate from his father's 40-year-old cans green beans that tasted faintly of history. Ranger still made his rounds morning and evening, still led Harold to things in corners and under tarps that he'd somehow walked right past the first 10 times. But underneath everything was different. The weight that had pressed on Harold's chest since the auction, it lifted, and in its place came something that felt almost dangerous: anticipation. He threw himself at the work like a younger man. The big sliding door, which had ground on its track, he fixed with parts scavenged from his father's stores. The gaps in the steel he patched with sheet metal Frank Whitley delivered one afternoon and refused to be paid for. Word had been moving through Hartwell, and the laughter that had followed the Ashcombs out of that auction hall, it had started slowly to quiet, because Frank had been talking too. "He's Harold Ashcombe," Frank reportedly said when somebody mocked the Stillwater purchase down at the feed store. "I've known the man 60 years. If he sees something in that land, then there's something there to see." Harold didn't know what to do with being defended. For 3 months he'd been nothing. Having someone stand up for him felt like a gift he hadn't earned. "You earned it," Eleanor told him. "You earned it being the kind of man people remember when things get hard. Frank's not doing you a favor. He's paying back a debt you don't even remember running up." And she was right. Over 60 years Harold had helped neighbors out of more holes than he could count. Equipment loans, emergency hay at midnight, just showing up when hands were needed, asking nothing. He'd never kept a ledger, never expected a thing back. Maybe that was the whole point. Henry called on a Thursday, 8 days after. "It's real," he said. "No preamble. All of it. The stocks are worth even more than I figured. Couple of those companies have done very well lately. The bonds are valid and they'll cash. The savings exists in a successor bank still accruing." A breath. "Harold, you're looking at roughly $620,000 in liquid assets." Harold sat down on an overturned bucket, the phone hard against his ear. Ranger came and sat beside him, sensing the way he always did that the air had changed. 620, Harold repeated. Give or take, there'll be tax, but your basis in these is so old the rates'll run in your favor. You could net $500,000 after everything settles. $500,000. More money than Harold had ever held at one time in his life, more than the farm had ever been worth, more than everything Garrett had stolen and lost and shrugged away. What do I need to do? Come in tomorrow. We'll start the paperwork to move it into accounts in your name. A pause, and then Henry's tone changed, got an edge to it. Harold, I need to tell you something, and I want you to hear it from me before you hear it from anybody else. Harold's stomach went cold. What is it? Garrett's been making calls around town. Henry's voice was careful and flat. He heard you've been working the Stillwater place, that you found things out there. He's been asking questions about your legal status, about inheritance law, about whether assets discovered on property a man owns are subject to claims from family members. The words hit the still water of Harold's chest and sent the cold rings spreading out. He's going to try to take it. He's going to try something. I don't know what yet, but everything your father left you is legally, cleanly yours. The property was in his name. The investments were in his name. You're his only heir. A beat. But that won't stop Garrett from making noise. Ranger growled, low, soft, as though he'd heard the name come down the phone line and understood exactly what it meant. Harold looked at his dog. Let him come, Harold said, and the steel in his own voice surprised him. Let him try. Garrett came on a Tuesday. Spring had come on in earnest by then. The fruit trees Harold had put in as saplings wore clouds of white. The garden beds Eleanor had laid out stood turned and ready, and the Quonset, its rust addressed its gaps, sealed its door running smooth on greased track, gleamed in the late light like something that had always belonged on that hill. Harold was out front fighting with the Farmall's fuel system when Ranger went rigid. The dog stood, faced the access road, and down the rutted gravel, throwing up a tail of dust, came a thing that had no business out there, a black sedan, sleek, expensive, wrong. Harold wiped his hands on a rag, and he waited. The car parked, and his eldest son got out. Harold hadn't laid eyes on Garrett in over a year, not since the day with the pamphlet, the day of I'll take care of the dog. The man who climbed out of that car looked prosperous, looked like a man who'd lost a great deal of other people's money, and somehow none of his own, in a suit that probably cost more than every stitch Harold owned put together. Dad, that voice, pitched to reasonable concern, that tone Harold had learned the hard way to distrust right down to the ground. We need to talk. Ranger's growl was a low, continuous thing, a rumble Harold felt through the soles of his boots more than heard. He laid a hand on the dog's back, didn't hold him, just rested it there. So talk, Harold said. Garrett came across the yard, his polished shoes filling up with dust at every step. He looked at the hut, at the cleared land, at the orchard, the garden, the months of work, standing up green and stubborn all around him, and something crossed his face. Surprise, or maybe calculation. With Garrett, you could never be sure where one stopped and the other started. I heard you've been making progress out here. A smile that didn't reach anything. That's good, Dad. Really. Say what you came to say, Garrett. The concern slipped a little, just at the corner. Fine. I know about the investments. I know about the deposit box in Des Moines, about the money Grandpa and Grandma apparently hid from everyone. They didn't hide it from everyone. Harold's voice was very quiet. They left it for me. Left it for you, or left it for the family. Garrett took a step closer, close enough that Ranger's growl climbed a full octave. I'm their grandson, their heir, same as you. Caroline Everett, me, we've all got a claim to whatever they left. And Harold studied his son, and for the first time, maybe ever, he saw him clear. Not the boy he'd raise, not the young man he'd sacrifice for, stood in the rain for gone without for. A stranger, wearing his son's face, a man who'd learned somewhere along the line to see love as leverage, family as a resource to be drawn down. You have a claim, Harold repeated, slow, to money your grandparents saved and invested and left to me, to assets you never knew about, never paid a dime toward, never had one reason on God's earth to expect. The law. I've talked to lawyers too, son. Garrett stopped. Everything your grandparents left is legally mine, Harold said, to do with as I please, and I please he let it land, not to share 1 cent of it with a man who stole my farm, emptied my retirement, and left me and your mother to die in a church parking lot. That's not fair. The investments failed. I was trying to help. You were trying to help yourself. Harold felt Ranger pressing into his leg, now the whole body of the dog vibrating with held-back fury. You saw 2 old people with something you wanted, Harold said, and you took it. And you didn't care what happened to us after. You didn't even, his voice caught and he made it go on. You were going to put the dog down Garrett, like he was a bag of trash that came with the house. Garrett's face hardened, the mask of concern gone now, all the way gone. You can't prove I did anything illegal. The risks were disclosed. The paperwork was clean. I'm not interested in proving anything. Harold gestured at the land, at all of it. The hut, the orchard, the green, stubborn life pushing up out of his father's 40-year-old ground. I'm not interested in courts. I'm interested in living, whatever years I've got left, with some dignity. You can't take that. That's the one thing you can't reach. We'll see about that. Garrett turned for the car, then stopped, and couldn't help himself. They never can. You know I tried to help you. The home was a good facility. You'd have been comfortable. That word again. Comfortable, Harold said, and it tasted like something gone bad. You wanted us comfortable and out of the way. You wanted to visit twice a year and feel good about yourself for it. And instead, you're standing in a barn talking to a man who's happier in it than he'd ever have been in your nice, clean facility. He looked his son in the eye. I'd rather live in this barn, Garrett, than in any palace you could build me, because at least here I know what I'm worth, and it isn't a number. Garrett left without another word. The sedan kicked up its tail of dust and was gone. Harold watched until it turned onto the highway and disappeared, and then he sat down hard on the front step of the Quonset, and Ranger climbed into his lap, all 70 pounds of him, pressed his face into Harold's chest. You're too big for this, Harold said, but he wrapped his arms around the dog and held on anyway. Garrett didn't waste time. Within the week, Henry called with the news Garrett had filed, a claim alleging that Walter Ashcombe's assets were part of a family trust, something to be divided among all the descendants. Caroline had added her name to the filing the same day. Everett, true to form, had declined to take part. Either way, it's baseless, Henry said. They don't have a leg to stand on. The will was clear. The assets were in your father's name alone. The property was bought decades before any grandchild drew breath. But, and here his voice slowed, they're betting you'll settle. Pay them something, just to make the whole ugly thing go away. I won't. I know. I just needed you to understand the play. So they prepared for it. And the legal mail started coming, and every envelope felt like a hand reaching for Harold's throat. And then, the night before the first hearing, it was late, past 11. Eleanor was asleep. Harold was awake the way he always was now, and Ranger was awake too, lying by the door with his ears working. And Harold heard the gravel, tires, slow, lights off. He went to the window. The black sedan parked down the access road in the dark well back from the hut, and a figure climbing out of it. Quiet, careful, carrying something. Garrett. Harold's heart slammed. He's going to burn it. He's come to burn the place down the night before court, except that wasn't it, because Harold watched, and the figure didn't go for the hut. It crouched, down low in the dark at the edge of the yard, and it made a sound, a soft, coaxing here boy sound. Holding out a hand, holding out was that food, and Harold understood all at once in a sick cold rush what his son was actually doing. He was calling the dog. He was trying to get Ranger to come, because if the old man's dog left the property and was found wandering, or worse, if there were marks on it, if a story could be told, neglect an unfit elderly owner, an animal in distress, evidence, the old man can't care for himself, can't even keep a dog, then the picture changed. Then a judge looked at it differently. Then competency became a question. Then maybe they didn't even need to win on the assets. Maybe they just needed Harold to look like a man who couldn't be left in charge of anything at all. It was so cold. It was so calculated. It was so exactly the kind of thing a man like Garrett would dream up in the dark. Ranger, Garrett was whispering out there. Come on, boy. Come here. And Ranger lifted his head, looked at the door, looked at the window where Harold stood, and then, God love him, that old gray-muzzled dog got up and walked away from the door and came and lay down across Harold's feet. He would not go. 11 years old, a treat in the dark and a familiar voice calling, and the dog chose the man on the floor over the man in the suit, the way he had chosen him every single day for 11 years, the way he would choose him until the day he couldn't choose anything anymore. Harold's eyes burned. He turned on the porch light. Out in the yard, Garrett froze in the sudden glare, caught crouched, one hand still out, and for one long second father and son looked at each other across 40 yards of dark and everything that had ever gone wrong between them. Then Garrett ran for the car. Harold didn't chase him. He couldn't have. He just stood in the doorway with his hand on his dog's head and watched the tail lights flee down the access road. And he thought about the small black box mounted under the eave of the hut, the trail camera Frank Whitley had brought out and bolted up there 2 weeks back half as a joke. Critters get into everything out here, Harold. Keep an eye on the place. It pointed straight at the yard. It had been running all night. The hearing was on a Friday. Henry brought a laptop in a battered leather bag and a calm that Harold envied, and a thing he called the exhibit that he would not let Harold look at again because he'd watched it 4 times already, and 4 times was enough. The courtroom was small. County courthouse, second floor, radiators ticking. Garrett sat on one side with his lawyer, a glossy man from the city, the kind who charged by the quarter hour. Caroline sat beside her brother in a gray suit, her face arranged into something meant to look like grief. She had flown in for this. She had not flown in when her parents were sleeping in a van, but she'd flown in for this. Everett was not there. Harold sat on the other side with Henry, and at his feet, because the judge had taken one look and waved a hand and said, "Let the animal stay," lay Ranger, still, watching, the only creature in the room without an angle. Garrett's lawyer went first. He talked a long time. He used the word family the way some men use a crowbar. He spoke of shared legacy and grandparental intent and the reasonable expectations of all the heirs, and he made it sound almost like the decent thing, like Harold was the one being small. Then Henry stood. He didn't talk long. "Your Honor," he said, "the assets in question were the sole property of Walter James Ashcombe, held in his name, left by clear written instruction to his only living child. That's the whole legal matter. It's not complicated." A pause. "But I'd ask the court's permission to address the question of character that opposing counsel has raised, because they've spent 20 minutes suggesting my client is an old man who maybe can't be trusted to manage his own affairs." The judge nodded. "I'd like to show the court something," Henry said. "Recorded 4 nights ago on my client's property at 11:40 in the evening." He turned the laptop around and he pressed play. The footage was gray, night vision green at the edges, but it was clear enough. It was clear enough to see the black sedan roll up the access road with its lights off. Clear enough to see a man in an expensive coat climb out and move across the yard, low, careful, glancing back at the road. Clear enough to hear through the little tinny speaker a voice, coaxing, soft. "Come on, boy, come here. Good dog. Come on." Clear enough to see him crouch At the edge of the dark, one hand out something in it, and clear enough, oh, it was clear enough to read the moment the porch light snapped on and caught Garrett Ashcombe, frozen in the act of trying to lure his father's dog off the property the night before he stood up in court and called the man unfit. The courtroom went very quiet, the kind of quiet that has a temperature. Harold watched his daughter's face, Caroline. He watched her turn slowly toward her brother, watched the careful grief slide right off her, like a sheet off furniture, and underneath it, not love for Harold, no, nothing so warm as that. Underneath it was the cold, pure terror of a person who has just felt the ground move and realized which side of a falling thing she's standing on. "You said," Caroline's whisper carried in the silent room, "Garrett, you told me you were just going to talk to him." "Shut up," Garrett said. But it was too late. It was already too late, because the man whose entire case was built on the picture of a feeble, failing old man, that man had just been filmed in the dark in the small, mean hours, doing the one thing no judge and no daughter in the world could call anything but exactly what it was. The judge took off her glasses. "Counsel," she said to the glossy man, "do you have anything you'd like to add?" He did not. The claim was dismissed before noon, but Harold barely heard it, because something had happened in that room that mattered more than any ruling. He had watched his son be seen. Not by him. Harold had seen Garrett clear for over a year now. By everyone else. By the judge. By the lawyer who suddenly couldn't meet anyone's eye. By Caroline, who would carry the image of that footage into every room she entered for the rest of her life. The brother she'd thrown in with, crouched in the dark calling a dog. Out in the hallway before they left, Harold did a thing he hadn't planned. He stopped in front of Garrett. His son wouldn't look at him, stared at a point on the wall, jaw tight, a man so used to winning that losing had no shape he recognized, and Harold found he wasn't angry. That was the strange part. He'd expected rage. He'd carried rage around for a year, like a coal in his pocket, warming his hands on it through every cold night in that van. And now, standing in front of the source of it all, he felt was tired. And under the tired, something worse, something like grief. Because this was his boy. This was the child he'd carried on his shoulders through the county fair. This was the small, warm weight that used to fall asleep against his chest during thunderstorms. And somewhere between then and now, Harold had failed to teach him the one thing that mattered. "I'm not going to have you arrested," Harold said. Garrett's eyes flicked to him. "Just for a second. Surprise. Henry says I could. The thing with the dog, the fraud maybe if we dug, he says I'd probably win." Harold shook his head slowly. "But I'm not going to spend the years I've got left feeding a fire. You're going to have to live with what you are, Garrett. That's the sentence. That's the whole sentence. You're going to wake up every morning for the rest of your life and be the man who did this." He turned to go, then turned back. "One more thing, because a father can't help it, even now. I loved you so much," Harold said, quiet, just for the two of them. "I want you to know that. Whatever else, I loved you more than my own breath." And he walked away, and he did not look back to see whether his son was crying. Because some doors you have to close while you can still pick up your feet. Spring deepened into something green and forgiving. The legal storm passed, and in its passing, Stillwater Lane kept on becoming what it was meant to be. The Quonset stood weather-tight now, painted proud solar panels gleaming on its curved roof, an extravagance Harold had allowed himself with a sliver of his father's money, the security of power that no one could shut off. A real bathroom went in plumb to a well that an old soil map of his father's had marked a faded blue line that Harold had dug down and found right where the dead man had drawn it. And the town came back. Funny how that works. When the Ashcombes had nothing, nobody wanted to know them. Now that they were standing now, that there was a story going around about the old man and the worthless land and the secret his father left. The casseroles started appearing on the porch, the invitations, the neighbors stopping by with offers of help They'd been too busy for all winter. "Are you angry about that?" Harold asked Eleanor one evening, the two of them, on the porch he'd built with his own hands, watching Ranger watch fireflies. He was far too old and stiff to chase. She thought about it. She always thought about it. "I was, for a while." She watched the dog give one half-hearted lunge and then settle satisfied with the effort. But holding on to it felt like drinking poison and waiting for somebody else to get sick. Most of these folks weren't cruel, Harold. They just didn't know how to help, so they stayed away. That's people. A beat. Frank didn't stay away. No, he didn't. Frank saw something in you that reminded him who you used to be, and he decided that was worth standing next to. She reached over, took his hand. That's friendship. The rest is just people being people. We don't have to forgive everything. We just have to decide what kind of folks we want to be. And what kind is that? The kind that builds. She smiled. Not the kind that keeps score. Ranger, having lost all interest in the fireflies, padded back up onto the porch and dropped between them with a groan, his fur damp with dew, and his tail swept the boards. Once, twice, and went still. It was Eleanor who found the cedar box. Down in the cellar, behind a row of mason jars she'd filled with pickled beets in the deep, cool dark where she'd taken to keeping things. She only found it, she said, because Ranger kept nosing at the jars, snuffling at the gap behind them until she moved them to see what the fuss was about. A small box, cedar, 6 inches square. The wood had kept its contents dry through all the years. She carried it up into the light, and Harold set down what he was doing, and they opened it together at the kitchen table. Inside, nested in faded velvet, were 2 things: a ring, a woman's ring, a small clear diamond catching the afternoon light, and a folded piece of paper in his father's hand. Harold knew the ring before he read the note. He'd seen it in a photograph that had hung in the farmhouse his whole childhood. It had belonged to his grandmother, Walter's mother, a woman dead before Harold was ever born. He unfolded the paper. "This ring was my mother's. She wore it every day of her married life and asked that it go to someone who understands what marriage really is. Not the ceremony, not the papers. The choosing to stay when staying is the hard thing. I never gave it to your mother. She had her own mother's ring, and this one was meant to wait for the right moment. If you found this, you found the rest of it. You did the hard work of not giving up. So give the ring to Eleanor. She's earned it. So have you." Harold's hands were shaking. He held the ring up to the window, and the little stone threw a scatter of light across the wall, tiny and bright and old. "Your grandmother's ring," Eleanor whispered. "He kept it all this time for you." "No," Harold's voice broke clean down the middle. "He kept it for you." And Eleanor, who had been a quiet woman her whole long life, who had stood beside this man for 62 years and rarely asked for one single thing, Eleanor put her hand to her mouth, and her eyes filled, and she did not say a word, because there were no words anywhere near big enough. "May I?" Harold asked. He nodded toward her left hand, where her thin, worn wedding band had sat for 62 years. She nodded. She couldn't speak, and Harold slid his grandmother's ring onto his wife's finger, where it settled beside the old band like it had been waiting there the whole time. 2 rings, one from 1963, one from before either of them was born, a chain of love stretching back further than they could see. "I, Harold Ashcombe," he said, soft in the kitchen with the dog at their feet and the spring light coming gold through the window, "take you, Eleanor Ashcombe, to be my wife, again, still, always." "You old fool," Eleanor laughed through her tears. "We're already married." "I know. I wanted to say it anyway." He kissed her forehead. "I wanted you to know if I had to do every bit of it over, every loss, every cold night, every single thing, I'd choose you. Without 1 second of thinking about it, I'd choose this. I'd choose us." And Ranger rose and pressed himself against both their legs and closed the small warm circle of the 3 of them the way he always did. Everett came in October. He came alone, no sedan, no lawyer. He came on a bus from the city and walked the last mile up Stillwater Lane with a duffel bag over his shoulder, and Harold watched him come from the porch and didn't move and didn't call out, just watched his youngest son walk up the road like a man walking toward a sentence. Everett stopped at the bottom of the steps. He was past 50 now, and he looked in that moment exactly like the small, worried boy he'd been, the one who'd hovered at the edge of every family photo like he wasn't sure he was allowed in it. "Dad," he said, and then he couldn't say anything else for a while. Harold didn't help him. Some things a man has to get across the floor on his own. "I know everything," Everett finally said. His voice was wrecked. "I want you to know that first, before anything. I knew Garrett was draining your accounts. I knew what the investments really were. I saw it happening. I saw it the whole time." "And you said nothing," Harold said. "Not cruel, just true." "And I said nothing." Everett's face came apart. "Because I've spent my whole life saying nothing. Because, Garrett, you don't know what he's like, Dad, when you cross him. You only ever saw the good son. I saw the other one. I saw what he did to people who got in his way." He stopped, steadied himself on the porch rail. "I have to tell you something, and it's going to hurt, and I'm sorry, but you need to know it because I think it's the only thing that explains any of this." Harold went very still. "It's about Grandma," Everett said. "About Margaret, her last years." "What about them?" "You weren't always there at the end. You couldn't be. You had the farm. You were 2 hours off. And Garrett, he lived close. He handled things. Remember? He always handled things." Everett's voice dropped. "Dad, he cut her off the last 2 years of her life. He told her you were too busy. He told you she was too tired for visits. He stood in the middle and he fed each of you a different lie, and he kept that old woman alone in her own house, and he—" Everett's voice failed. "I was there once, just once. I came up without telling him, and she grabbed my hand, Dad, and she said, I think they've all forgotten me. And I didn't fix it. I was 20-some years old and scared of my brother, and I didn't fix it. And she died thinking her family had let her go." The kitchen door was open. Eleanor stood in it, one hand pressed to her chest. Harold sat down on the top step, hard, because all at once, it made a different kind of sense. His father. The journal. "I've seen what happens when families fight over money. The hidden property, the secret box, the desperate, careful preparation of a man who came home from a war and spent the rest of his life building nets under people who didn't know they were falling. Walter hadn't been getting ready for some far-off war or crash. He'd been getting ready for this, for a family that ate its own, because he'd seen it before, hadn't he? I've seen what happens. He'd watched it happen somewhere, some other family, some other old person left to drift, and he'd sworn it would not happen to his blood, and so he'd hidden a fortune 3 miles from his own front door and trusted it to the one thing he believed in, that someday when the rot came around again, it would land in the hands of whoever still had the heart to need it. It wasn't a net for Harold. It was a net for the pattern, a net thrown across the generations, because Walter had understood a thing. It had taken Harold 81 years and a Quonset hut full of secrets to finally understand that the cruelty repeats unless somebody stops it. His mother, Margaret, who'd written, "I'll love you till the stars go dark," and died believing she'd been forgotten. Garrett had done to her exactly what he'd tried to do to Harold, the isolating, the discarding, the slow, quiet erasing of an old person whose usefulness had run out. It hadn't started with the farm. It had started a generation back, and it would have rolled right on down through Everett's children and theirs world without end, except Walter Ashcombe had buried a stop sign in the ground. Everett was holding out something, a small flash drive, his hand trembling. "There's enough on here to put him in prison," he said. "The withdrawals, the forged authorizations, Grandma's accounts too. I went back, I found it all. I've been finding it for months. I couldn't be brave when it mattered, so I'm trying to be brave now when it's almost too late." He set it on the step beside Harold. "It's yours. Do whatever you want with it. I'd understand if you put him away. I'd understand if you never wanted to look at me again either." Harold looked at the little drive. So small, so much weight in such a small thing. The power to end his eldest son, to finally fully balance every cold ledger Garrett had ever kept. He picked it up, and he held it, and then he set it back down. "No," Harold said. Everett blinked. "Dad, I'm not going to send your brother to prison, not because he doesn't deserve it. He does, but because I've spent a year now learning what poison does to the hand that holds it, and I'm done holding it." He looked up at his son. "Your grandmother died thinking she was forgotten. I can't fix that. God knows I'd give the rest of my years to fix that. But I can do this. I can stop the thing here. With me." The chain ends on Stillwater Lane. He stood. His knees complained. He let them. "You want to know how to be brave? Everett, too late to fix it isn't bravery. Bravery is what you do next." He nodded at the duffel bag. "How long can you stay?" Everett stared at him. His voice cracked. "As long as you'll have me." "Then put your bag inside," Harold said. "Your mother made too much soup. She always makes too much soup. Like she's still feeding a farm full of hands." And he watched his youngest son's face fall apart in the best possible way, and he watched Eleanor come out onto the porch and take Everett's hands, and he watched Ranger circle the boy, once, twice, nose working, taking his measure, and then sit, which from Ranger was the highest verdict there was. They did not all live happily ever after. That's a thing they tell you in stories, and it isn't how it works, and Eleanor would be the first to say so. Garrett didn't repent. Men like Garrett rarely do. He moved away. The footage had a way of preceding him. In a town the size of Hartwell, and Caroline, whose name was on the filing, found that her own carefully built world cooled toward a woman who'd helped try to rob her own parents. There were consequences, just not the kind that come in handcuffs, the kind that come slower, the kind a person earns one cold morning at a time. But Everett stayed. He stayed through the fall and into the winter, and he started clumsily at first to learn the shape of the work. Fence posts and feed and the patience of growing things. And somewhere in the doing of it, he began to straighten up the way a sapling straightens when you finally take the weight off it. The soup got eaten, and the long winter passed warm for once in a hut that everyone had laughed at. And, in the spring, Harold did the thing his mother had told him to do in a letter he'd carried for a year now and read until the creases went soft. Use it to help people who need helping. He called it Stillwater Sanctuary. It started small, a spare room, a second-hand bed. The first one was a widow named Doris from over in the next county, 83 years old, whose son had done to her something not so different from what Garrett had done. She came with one suitcase and a frightened look, and the particular shame of an old person who has been made to feel like a burden. And Eleanor took her hands at the door, the way she'd taken Everett's, and said the only words that mattered: "You're not a burden here. You're a guest." And then there was another, and another. Frank Whitley came on as a kind of unpaid handyman and full-time grumbler. Pastor Reyes lent his church van permanently and his Sundays gladly. Henry Blackfeather drew up the paperwork for free and sat on the board and pretended to be annoyed about both. And the money, Walter's money, Margaret's money, the careful, patient fortune of two people who died believing it would someday find the right hands, that money went exactly where they'd hoped it would. It went to the forgotten, the traded away, the old folks who'd been counted up and found too expensive by the very children they'd once carried on their shoulders. Stillwater Sanctuary took them in one at a time and gave them back the one thing nobody had bothered to leave them: dignity. And it was Eleanor, quiet. Eleanor, who'd stood at the edge of her own life for 79 years, the way Everett had stood at the edge of the family photos. It was Eleanor who became the heart of the place. The woman who'd rationed her own breath now spent her days filling a hut full of strangers with the warmth she'd held quiet inside her all those decades. She bloomed. There's no other word for it. She bloomed late and she bloomed hard, like the last and best rose of a long season. I spent my whole life being beside you, she told Harold one evening, the two of them on the porch, always the porch. I don't regret a minute of it, but I think I was waiting for something to be mine, and I never knew it until it showed up. She gestured at the lit windows of the hut, the sound of voices, of somebody's old radio, of a house full of people who'd thought their lives were over and had just found out they weren't. This is mine, Harold. It is. Ours. Ours, he agreed. And here is where the story ends. Not with a fortune, though there was one. Not with a courtroom, though justice of a quiet and incomplete kind was done. Not even with a wedding, though two old people stood in a kitchen and chose each other one more time, with a dead woman's diamond shining between them. It ends on a porch. 2 springs on now. Harold sat in a chair he'd built from a fallen oak, with a tired old gray-muzzled dog stretched in the sun at his feet and a letter in his lap. The last one. The love letters between his father and his mother, found in a workshop box near the bottom of everything. 50 years of 2 people writing to each other across the same small house, because Walter Ashcombe could write the words he could never say. Harold read them in the evenings now, and he understood finally the man he'd buried at 41. Not cold, never cold, just a soul that loved the way some men love, in provision, in protection, in nets thrown silent under the ones he could not bear to see fall. Ranger was slower these days. He felt the cold mornings in his hips, and he gave up on the fireflies sooner than he used to. But he still made his rounds at dawn. That old dog still walked the boundary of the 3 acres and checked the fences and took the measure of his world, the post he had never once stopped believing in. He came and laid his head on Harold's boot, and his tail moved against the boards, slow and content, and went still. The hut glowed behind them, full of light, full of voices, full of people the world had thrown away, learning they were worth keeping. Eleanor came out and sat beside him. She didn't ration her breath anymore, not the way she once had. She took his hand the way she had for 64 years now, and her grandmother-in-law's ring caught the last of the light. "You're wool gathering again," she said. "Just thinking about my father." A pause. "We didn't fail them, Elle. The kids, I used to think we failed them." "We didn't fail Everett." "No, we didn't fail Everett." He squeezed her hand. "And the rest of it, maybe we just never taught them the one thing, that a person's worth isn't a number, that you don't get to weigh the people who carried you." He looked out over the dark green land. "I think that's the whole lesson in the end, the only one that matters. You can take a man's farm, you can take his money, you can take his name out of every mouth in a town that used to love him." He turned to her. "But you can't take what he decides to be. That part's his, right down to the last day. That part is always, always his." The sun finished going down, and the curved roof of the Quonset, the rust pile, the tin can, the joke that the whole town had laughed at, caught the last of the gold and held it just for a moment like something precious, like something that had always belonged exactly where it stood. Inside, somebody started to sing, off-key, old, happy. And out on the land that nobody wanted, the dew settled and the oaks stood their watch in the windbreak corner, and Harold Ashcombe held his wife's hand on a porch he'd built with his own 2 hands. The land provides for the ones who don't give up on it. His father had told him that, and his father, it turned out, had been right about almost everything.